you're juggling dozens of cases at a time, if not more. And so you really have to triage your cases and prioritize your cases. And working active cases is very different than working cold cases. With cold cases, you have more of a luxury of slowing down and deciding what you're going to prioritize and which cases you're going to be working on. But with active cases that are just coming in, it's not that way. So usually, yes, most detectives, and myself included, I had multiple cases on my desk at all times. And so it was just a matter of really being able to utilize good time management skills to, organize. How are you going to work this case? What are the priorities? I would kind of have a to-do list for a case. So what do I need to accomplish? Are there things that I need to send to the crime lab for, additional testing or any testing, whether it be DNA or, ballistics evidence, or maybe something needs fingerprint processing. So evaluating the evidence that has been collected already, looking to see who needs to be interviewed or maybe re-interviewed. Certainly it's always important to go out and to visit the crime scene. And that is especially true even with cold cases. And sometimes the crime scene isn't there anymore, but it's still important to go out there. So, you just have to sort of assess what the needs are for each individual case. And, then you just kind of run down the list and check off your list until you get to the end and you've done everything that you can do on that case. And then, maybe it ends in an arrest. Maybe it ends in referring the case to the prosecutor's office for a charging decision. Or, in some cases, it may be the case gets closed for a variety of reasons. So the case that occurred in my childhood that I wrote about is a case from 1986, and it was a young girl who went out for a bike ride in Point Defiance Park, which is a massive 700-acre park in Tacoma, and she never returned home. And there was a massive search for her. It took 24 days, and then finally her body was found in a wooded area of the park. Her case was unsolved and remained unsolved for 32 years. Now, what made her case interesting is that there was another case that occurred 4.5 months prior to hers that was nearly identical. The case also was unsolved. And I didn't write as much about the first case in the book because that one was actually pending trial at the time that I was writing the book, and it was getting published. And so I agreed not to write about that case. But ultimately, there were two girls, a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old girl, who were brutally raped and murdered in Tacoma in 86, 4.5 months apart. And they were believed to be killed by the same offender. And the similarities were so striking. Both girls were blonde, blue-eyed, on bikes in, parks in the north end of Tacoma. Both were sexually assaulted. Both were left in wooded areas. I mean, it was a no-brainer almost, right? That these girls had been killed by the same guy. So there was a lot of fear in the community. There was a thought that maybe it was a serial killer. And those cases really had a huge impact on me in my childhood, and as well as everyone else in the community. I mean, they were really like urban legend, and they honestly were just a black cloud over the city for 3 decades. I knew about the cases, of course, growing up, and then when I became a detective, I had the opportunity to actually work on their cases. And then eventually I took over their cases when I became the cold case detective, and, got to meet their families and really developed a close relationship with the mother of one of the girls. And so, it was an emotional roller coaster ride working on those cases because we had DNA from the suspect in both cases. It was in CODIS, which is the Combined DNA Index System, or the National DNA Database. That DNA didn't match anybody in the database. And so it was basically up to me and the other detectives that worked on the case over the 30 years to try to figure out how are we going to solve these cases, because we've got DNA. So we should be able to identify the offender, but how are we going to do it? And so it just really came down to pulling out all the stops. And so that's what I go through, and that's what I explain in the final chapter of the book, is really like what was done, what I did to try to solve the cases, and then ultimately, how they ended up getting resolved. Don't take no for an answer. That's my advice. Over my career, I've had a lot of people tell me, no, that can't be done. No, you can't do that. And just understand that there's always, like, if you're trying to solve a problem, if you're trying to do something for the greater good, if you're trying to get justice for victims, there's always another way. And I could come up with example after example of that. And, probably the best example I can give is that one of my passions throughout my career has been an issue that is referred to as lawfully owed DNA. And basically that means convicted offenders who have slipped through the cracks and they're not in the DNA database. And I found example after example of that in my state. I eventually came across an offender who I thought he was basically a serial killer and rapist, and he was not in the database. And I was told he couldn't be entered into the database because he did not qualify, even though he committed a triple homicide of a mother, her 8-year-old daughter, and another woman. I was told he didn't qualify for the DNA database. And that didn't sit well with me. And so I ended up having to work with state legislators to change the law in Washington state so that he could be entered into the database along with others just like him. And as a result of that, I ended up getting his DNA into the database in 2020 and ended up solving a 1975 murder case of a young woman, a young student at the University of Washington who had been murdered back in 75, and the case was unsolved all these years.